Since the start of Season 12, we here at SkillCapped have been researching the top solo queue players to identify what makes them so special to be at the head of the pack in the race to Challenger. Powered by an insatiable curiosity, or more likely far too many cups of coffee, we found ourselves with dozens upon dozens of tabs open of top player profiles from North America, EU West, and Korea. And in that caffeine-induced fever dream, we kept analyzing replay after replay, not only looking for what made these players so special, but what they had in common, what us mere mortals could hope to replicate in our own game so we too could climb the ladder like a solo queue god. And strangely enough, through all of this, one player stood out above the rest. I say strangely because this wasn't some well-known pro with a ton of accolades under his belt like Canyon in the LCK or Yankos in the LEC. No, instead it's a lesser-known pro player from North America called Onda. So what did this guy do to make him stand out amongst the giants? Well, first, he was putting up some insane numbers, game after game with KDA and kill participation through the roof. All this while being the second highest ranked jungler on the ladder, so he was facing some of the best players while doing this. I mean, it was clear from the onset that this is someone who knows how to carry solo queue games, and so the next question was naturally, how was this guy doing it? Well, as we said, based on his KDA and kill participation, we expected some insane aggression and proactive play, but to our surprise, this was not how he was stomping games. Instead, he was using basic information gathering and decision making to crush opponents, something any player could apply. That's why we chose his games over the big name pros. There's something special everyone can learn from in this guide. Now, I'm sure every person watching this has heard at some point the advice of checking your minimap more and the importance of warding and gathering information. But I think there's a common problem that we can all relate to that rarely gets addressed, and we know it holds us back from ranking up. It's being overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information to the point that we become lost and either can't determine what's the right decision or can't make that right decision fast enough. For example, imagine you just started a game and you're at your red buff. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how much information you have available to you and how difficult it is to make a correct decision. Let's just pick one lane, top lane. The matchup is Tryndamere against Victor. Immediately you have questions like, is that lane worth ganking? Who's supposed to win that matchup? Wait a second, what camp should I be doing after my red buff? Should I rush a fast level 3 with red, Raptors into Gromp? It would let me get top lane faster, but what if there's no gank available when I finish this round? Let's say you decide to do your Raptors, and you check top, and you notice that Tryndamere is actually the one pushing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Wait a second, can my Tryndamere be ganked by the enemy jungler? He is pushing. Where did the enemy jungler even start? I forgot. Ah, that's right, he started blue, so he can gank top at the end of his route. Okay, so should I counter gank that? What if I waste my time? Do we even win the 2v2? Suddenly, through all this, you check your mid lane, now they're pushed up. Wait, do I counter gank mid instead? Do I win that 2v2? You get the idea. Maybe in that scenario I just laid out, you actually can come to the correct decision given enough time, but when in a real game, you find yourself unable to apply that knowledge at a fast enough rate. As you can see, most players' problems isn't that they don't gather enough information, it's that they don't know how to process that information into a correct decision or at a fast enough speed or just both. And so that's what you'll be learning in this guide, is how to take all this overwhelming information and reduce it down into simple, easy to follow rules and patterns. But before we get into that, let's be honest. This is you playing League of Legends. And this is a picture of your match history. But we can change that at skillcapped.com, link in the description below. Now back to the video. Alright, so let's get into it. In this game, Onda is playing Kindred against Viego jungle. Let's first set up this scenario. The enemy has a Blitzcrank support, and so knowing how common it is for Blitz to invade the bottom side jungle before minions spawn, Kindred just immediately heads to the Pixel Brush top side, then waits for the enemy to show invading, and moves into the enemy's red. He then sees the enemy retreating from his red, so he recalls and drops a ward while doing so. Now, none of the specifics of this matters for what you're going to learn. It's just by placing an early ward on the red, we'll have more information on the enemy jungler, which just makes the general concepts we're going to teach you much easier for you to understand. Kindred then swaps to a sweeping lens and heads to his red buff. As a side note, this is a great trick whenever you get invaded like this early. Swap to a sweeping lens so you can clear any wards as you do your buff. This will prevent any kind of cheese invade or hook to steal your buff, and it also prevents the enemy from knowing which camp you headed to after you kill the buff, preventing them from knowing your opening route. You'll see why this is important. So, when Onda is at his red buff, he can check his ward on the enemy's red. Not only does he see that Viego is starting there, but more important is that we can see what camp he goes to after. In this case, he heads towards his Krugs. So why is this piece of information important? Well, we now know Viego will be busy with his Krugs for the next 10 to 15 seconds, and after only has two choices, head top to gank or head towards his Raptors. Essentially, we know every possible move Viego can do in the next 30 seconds. Still, you're probably wondering, okay, how is this useful? What are the practical implications? Well, I want you to take a look at things from Viego's perspective. Firstly, he doesn't know where we're starting. It's not until Tryndamere shows top first while our bot is missing does he know Kindred is getting a leash at our red. By then, he's already committed to taking the Krugs. He He also doesn't know what route Kindred is going after she does red. For example, if Kindred headed to her Krugs, well then it would be likely she would be doing something like red, Krugs, Raptors for the same side level 3. That allows her to then gank mid after, invade, or even gank bot lane with that level 3 spike. Alternatively, he could have seen Kindred go to her Raptors after, in which case, doing something like red Raptors into Gromp for a fast level 3 would be more likely. Notice how, with this route, Kindred is on the complete opposite side of the map with a completely different level 3 timing. Hell, I mean, Viego even has to be worried Kindred would do something like red, off the Dragon Pit wall, and just immediately steal his blue side jungle. The point here is that Viego is just at a straight up disadvantage, an information disadvantage, and that's a simple rule to follow. The less information an opponent has, the more likely they are to make a mistake. You'll learn how to make use of this shortly. So Kindred does red, then Raptors, and then moves to her blue side quadrant. So all the time you have probably heard coaches and top players give the advice of checking your minimap more. But that's not exactly useful. Like, imagine you're fighting a jungle camp. How can you check your minimap, then move the camera, while also casting spells and kiting the camp in the direction you want to head next to save time? Well, there's a simple rule to follow that will make checking your minimap far easier. Look out for moments in your game that require a low amount of actions, meaning a low amount of mouse clicks or keyboard presses. For example, let's say you're Kha'Zix and you're fighting the Raptor camp. You may start out having to right-click a small Raptor close to you, then queuing a different Raptor to spread your damage and put the ability on cooldown, pull them back to clump them, then right-click into them so you can cast your W, an AoE ability to hit all of them, then right-click the big Raptor, which has the most health. Then make sure to cast your Q as it comes off cooldown, but making sure not to cancel an auto attack when you do so your jungle item burn is about to expire on the small Raptors, so you then E the minions to reapply the burn and do AoE damage. You get the idea here. As you can see, this is basically when you're at a high amount of actions. However, compare that to when you move between one camp and another. You are literally right-clicking a single time. It's just one action. During that time, for example, when you're walking towards your wolves, there's not a single other action for you. And this is when you want to check the minimap, move your camera, and gather information. And this may sound simple, but realize how once you understand the principle, check the minimap when my actions are low, you can then build upon it. Again, go back to the Kha'Zix clearing Raptors, so your actions are high at the start, but notice how there's a moment when all your abilities are on cooldown and you're just auto-attacking the same target. You have a window here before your next Q comes off cooldown that you can just check the minimap and move the camera if necessary. This is the value of understanding simple rules or principles. Sure, it starts with applying that rule, such as check the minimap when actions are low, in its most simple state. In this case, checking the minimap when moving between camps. But then as you get the basic scenarios mastered, you start applying it to more difficult situations. Compare this to if you had just tried to simply look at your minimap more often. You would be completely overwhelmed at trying to balance everything and would see minimal improvement. Great, now that we understand that, we can jump back into the game. Onda is moving from his Raptors to his Wolves. We know now's the best time to check the minimap and gather information. Here's the next problem though. We have an entire map of information available to us and we don't have infinite time. Once we get to our wolf camp, not only do our actions then increase, taking up our brain's ability to process information, but we also have to make decisions at that point. Should we take our wolves? Should we skip them and do Gromp instead? Basically, we're on a timer. And this is League of Legends in a nutshell. We have way too much information at our disposal and very little time to process it. So the first trick to solving this is to immediately identify and remove any information that is useless. And there's a very simple way to identify useless information. It's information that even if we did have, would not change our decision. For example, in this position, we're heading to our blue side jungle, which is on the top side of the map. Let's say we decide to look bot lane during this time, and we see the enemy is low on health and pushed up the lane. Could we do anything with this information? Would we change our decision? The answer is no. We have 3 camps alive topside, we only have 1 bot side. There's a lack of gold and XP after the gank. This increases the risk and lowers the reward. Also, it would take us an extremely long time to walk all the way bot lane, at which time the lane state could always change, resulting in the enemy bot lane being in a safer position, or maybe they have a ward that spots us. Essentially, the risk versus reward is terrible for us, but notice how we just had to spend a ton of time processing exactly why it was terrible. If our goal is to quickly identify and remove useless information, well then taking over 10 seconds to do that, well, that's not exactly fast enough. So instead, try to think of the general patterns or rules in our risk versus reward analysis. Firstly, one side of the map had more camps compared to the other. This increases the possible reward we can gain from being on that side of the map. Second, the distance from us. The further the distance, the more time it takes, time that we could have spent farming or getting golden XP in some other way, so by its very nature, the further away something is, the higher the risk, as the lane state could also change by the time we get there. So now that you have those 2 rules in mind, if we jump back into the game, as we finish our Raptors and head towards the top side of the map, it becomes very easy for us to see 2 things. First, bot side is 1 camp and bot lane is far away. This gives it a high probability that it's useless information. Great, so rule that out, don't spend time moving your camera there, instead focus on mid or top. Now in this case, mid lane is closest to us and top lane is furthest. Why is this distinction so important? Well, when we move our camera, we want to check mid first because it's what we can react to the fastest. If we gather information there, like the enemy mid is super low, all-inning our teammate, using flash, we can instantly react and be there in time to kill them. At the same time, if reacting ends up resulting in us gaining nothing, we can quickly turn around and head back to the nearby camps. Compare that to if we went top lane. Even if we saw Victor was low on health, it's a very difficult decision to make, since we have to cover so much distance. The lane state could change during that time, and if it does, we have to run much further to get back to the camps to farm. So think of how much easier and faster information gathering is following these principles. As soon as we finish Raptors and head to our Wolves, we know not to waste our time checking bot lane. Immediately check mid since it's closest. In this case, nothing requires our immediate reaction. We do see Syndra has the clear minion advantage and so is pushing. We want to make a mental note of that, as when a laner is pushed, it means mainly two things. First, they're more vulnerable to a gank, and second, they're able to react to things before the enemy laner since the enemy will be pinned down by the wave. This is often referred to as lane priority. Alright, so then we move on to top lane, and we see the same lane state. Tryndamere has the minion advantage and is therefore pushing. Now, given the jungle tracking we've done on Viego's early pathing, I want you to tell me, which lane is under threat of being ganked first? Is it top lane or mid lane? Well, the answer is top lane. We saw Viego move towards his Krug's topside, and he hasn't shown moving back across to his Raptors yet, and so in theory, he could kill his Krugs and then gank top. And it's moments like these, a lot of players struggle. You see, any remotely high-level jungler would just tell you this gank is highly unlikely, mainly because of how risky executing this gank would be. Viego would have done his red, Krugs, still be level 2, gank top, and now look at how far he'd be from the rest of his camps that are alive. If the gank doesn't work or takes too long, well, Kindred will hit level 3 during that time, be massively ahead, and know where Viego is due to him showing on the map when he ganked. Kindred at that point can just aggressively invade with her level advantage and just totally shut him down. But for the average player, how can you remember all of that in real time in a random game in this very specific scenario? It's pretty difficult, right? So instead, I want you to try looking at this in a different way. Notice how first, we gathered information on the lanes that we could influence, mid and top. We saw that both are pushed. This meant they're potentially vulnerable to a gank. We then identified which lane was closest to the enemy jungler, as this is the one that could be ganked first. In this case, that was top. Great, now all you have to ask is, can I react in time to counter gank? In this case, the answer is no. I am so much further away from top lane than Viego. Great, stop your analysis there and save your brainpower to spend on something else. Why? Because even if counter ganking would result in getting a double kill, it simply doesn't matter, you can't get there in time. This is the trick to quick analysis. Find simple rules and patterns that you can use to identify what to discard. Notice how we just turned that whole analysis of what will happen if Viego ganks top into, well, I can't counter gank in time anyway, so let me think about something else. This is a great technique to keep yourself focused on the game and on what you can actually impact. It has a natural flow to it. You want to save the more detailed analysis for after the game, when you can go over the replay and think things through. Alright, so shortly after, Kindred spots Viego crossing back over towards his Raptors. Now again, checking our nearby lanes, we identify Syndra is even more pushed up than before, so definitely under threat of being ganked. So now we ask, can I react in time to counter gank? Well, yeah, we're pretty much the same distance away as Viego. Great, so we now know this requires our attention, and that we actually do need to analyze this further. In this case, the first question you should ask to determine whether you should counter gank is just, how easy is it for the enemy jungler to kill my teammate? Well, Syndra is quite pushed up, and so from a positioning perspective, she is quite easy to gank. But she's full health, has flash, and is a level up on Qiyana, who's still level 1. In fact, Viego is still level 2, as he's only cleared his red and Krugs, so he's lacking an ability to help the gank hit harder. So it would be pretty difficult to kill Syndra here as Viego, and so if he did gank, he would likely waste a lot of his time and get very little for it. And the reason why I'm spending time talking about this is that it's a very important lesson, that it's okay to let your teammates get ganked if the gank has a low probability of working out, as it will waste the enemy jungler's time and reveal them on the map. Alright, so we continue farming, and as we move to our next camp, when our actions are low, we again check our nearby lanes we can influence, making sure to ignore bot lane. So starting with mid, we see no gank is available for us, so we then ask if there is a gank available for the enemy. Yes, there definitely is. Syndra is pushed up, and Viego is very close to her at his Raptors. Second question, can I react in time to counter gank? Well, we're slightly further than Viego, but not by much. We could probably get there in time to turn the fight if we wanted to. So we identify the threat, we can also react to that threat, and the next question is, well, should we? In this case, Syndra is even more pushed up than before, so from a positioning perspective, she's super easy to gank. She's also taken some damage and is now the same level as Qiyana, so yeah, she's under a big threat of being ganked. Also, Viego will now be level 3 after killing Raptors. A gank on Syndra has a very high chance of working out for Viego. So we now know that a gank is not only highly probable, but will also likely result in an advantage for the enemy team. And yet, Kindred decided to completely ignore the counter gank and continue farming. Why? Well, the last question you want to ask yourselves is, do we win the ensuing fight if we do counter gank? You can typically find that answer by looking for very simple advantages and disadvantages. One very obvious disadvantage we have is that Viego is level 3, while we're still level 2. We have to kill blue to level up. By the time we do that, we won't be able to react to the gank. Being an entire level down is obviously a massive disadvantage. But hey, maybe our laner has an advantage of her own to then compensate. No, if anything, Syndra is down in health and they're the same level as Qiyana. And it's really that simple. We would be at the disadvantage, so just keep farming instead of counter ganking. There's no need to go into in-depth analysis of the matchup, how it would play out, what abilities would be used. Start with the simple stuff first. Sure enough, our Syndra does in fact die shortly after that super obvious gank that was coming, but we didn't let the Syndra's poor decision of pushing up like that become our decision, counter ganking. That's how you become hard stuck. So Kindred is about to finish her blue now, and again, I want to emphasize this idea of trying to simplify things. As a jungler, we want to check the lane states, but in this position, we are so far away from bot and mid that as far as information gathering is concerned, they really are not a priority since we can do very little with that information. Instead, since top lane is the lane we can influence after we do kill our blue, we want to move our camera and gather information there. What do we see? The enemy Victor is low in health and our Tryndamere has 8 minions to the enemy's 3, meaning it's pushing towards the enemy Victor. Your jungle senses should be tingling. There's an opportunity here. I want you to tell me, with this information, what should Kindred do after she takes her blue buff? The answer, tower dive the Victor. There are 2 main red flags at play here you want to look for that indicates a tower dive is possible. First, that the enemy is low on health, as this means you can kill them faster under tower and give the turret very little time to damage you. Second, that your teammate has a big wave. This way, once the wave crashes under the tower, you have plenty of time to set up the dive and move towards them. Now, tower dives are one of the most punishing ganks when pulled off correctly. You can see how since Victor died, he now loses all that golden XP from that big wave built up. If this wasn't enough, when the big wave crashes into a tower like this, and the enemy wave gets caught on it, it will cause what's called a rebound, where it starts pushing back in the opposite direction. What this means is that not only is Victor behind due to dying, but even further behind from losing the wave to the tower, and now the wave is actually pushing back towards the opponent who has a lead, leaving him either vulnerable in the 1v1 or vulnerable to a repeat gank by the jungler. So, with that being said, tower dives are also riskier, since counter ganks are even more of a threat by the enemy jungler, as the tower almost acts like a third player, guaranteed they win the fight. That's why whenever you identify a good gank opportunity, especially with a tower dive, you have to ask where the enemy jungler is, and whether they can counter gank you. In this case, we saw Viego bot side ganking Syndra. That's how we knew this tower dive was going to be safe. I want you to notice how in this section, in both cases, being the one ganking or the one counter ganking, you have to ask the question, how far is each jungler from that lane? Okay, so now that you have a much better understanding of how to gather information and actually use it, you can fully appreciate just how punishing a lack of information can be. So let's take a look from the enemy jungler Viego's perspective. Kindred just tower dove Victor and then left into Fog of War. Currently, we're doing Scuttle as Viego. We can follow the same principles just taught. The first step is discarding useless information. In this case, that's top lane since it's way too far away. That leaves mid lane and bot lane. We should probably check mid lane first since that's also closest to where we saw the enemy jungler last, so it is a possible threat. So we take a look mid, we're just mainly looking at the minions and the health of both champions. They're both near equal in health, but Qiyana is pushed up and is vulnerable to being ganked because of that. So the question is, how likely is it that the enemy jungler will gank this? Well, let's look at how much time has passed since we last saw Kindred on the map. Because so much time has passed, we don't know what she's doing. At this point, she could be at her Gromp, ganking mid, looking to repeat gank top. She could be recalling and heading towards bot side. Notice how much this, well, sucks. Not only can Viego not answer the question due to the lack of information, but he also doesn't know whether to spend more time analyzing it. For example, if Kindred was close to mid, then he would need to spend more time analyzing whether he'd win the ensuing fight, whether it's actually worth counter ganking. Notice how with a lack of information, not only is it more likely you'll make a wrong decision, but you'll also end up wasting more time analyzing something you shouldn't. And in this case, Viego chose to hover mid to protect his Qiyana. And his logic is pretty sound. I mean, there's a good chance Qiyana can either die or lose a lot from a gank here, and Kindred could be in the area. And yet, Kindred never ganked. She simply farms her Gromp and then recalls. In the meantime, Viego is wasting a ton of time just hovering mid, expecting this gank to come. This is the power of information, or more accurately, the power of denying your opponent information. If we go back to when Kindred tower dove top, she then took the scuttle after. It's in this moment she has a decision to make. She can look to repeat gank top, gank mid, do her Gromp, or just recall. And here's what's really crazy, is that from Kindred's perspective, the last time we saw Viego was when he killed Syndra. It's been nearly 30 seconds that he's been hiding in Fog of War. Basically, in this moment, both junglers are actually in the exact same position. They lack information, and there's a plethora of options for each jungler, and I think this highlights a key lesson we can all take from Anda's playstyle. It's not that he's choosing to farm because ganking lanes would be risky and might not pan out. By risky, I mean, what if we go to repeat gank top, but Victor reads it and just plays safe, and maybe we eventually get his flash, basically just waste a lot of our time while not getting a quick kill on him. Or we gank mid, but Viego comes from Fog of War for the counter gank. These are obviously bad scenarios that could happen, but it's that on top of those risks, if we do gank, we're going to be revealing ourselves on the map. And with that idea of how giving away information is a disadvantage in the back of your mind, let's go back to that option of ganking top. Realize that if we repeat gank Victor, that not only does Viego then have perfect information on us once we reveal ourselves, but we're also extremely far off the map. Viego would then have a ton of options as a response. He knows he can freely gank mid or bot without a risk of a counter gank, or just invade our red side jungle to steal camps. That's why Kindred simply takes her Gromp and then recalls. It may seem like we're not pressuring the map, but as counterintuitive as it sounds, by not revealing ourselves on the map, we're actually applying more pressure. We could literally be anywhere, waiting to gank top, ganking mid, maybe we recalled and now are heading bot side. We're Schrodinger's jungle, stuck in a superposition of being on and off the map at the same time, and the longer we stay in that state, while accumulating some form of golden experience, often the better. Don't believe me? Well, Kindred stayed cool and collected under this anxiety of options, perfectly content with holding information, while the enemy Viego cracked under the pressure, not only wasting time hovering mid, but then revealing himself on the map right after. Keep in mind, it's been nearly a full minute where both junglers don't really know where each other are, and it's now broken by this Viego gank on mid. Just check out how fast Onda is going to capitalize on this information advantage. Now, Viego was able to hit level 4 by helping shove the wave in mid, but when he revealed himself on the map, all Onda had to do was hit tab and see he had not recalled prior to this gank. Since Onda has recalled, he has 2 longswords and a dagger in terms of item advantage, which far outweighs a single level lead. At the same time, the enemy mid Qiyana is low on health and out of mana, so she has to recall or just be useless in any fight, and Kindred's bot lane has the push advantage. This effectively means Kindred has lane priority in both mid lane and bot lane, meaning they can respond to any nearby fight before the opponent. So just like with the earlier tower dive example, your jungle senses should be tingling. I want you to tell me, what should Kindred do in this position? The answer, invade Viego. There are 2 main conditions that allow you to invade an enemy jungler. The first is being stronger than them, which we are with our item lead, and 2, having lane priority, so we don't get collapsed on by the enemy laners. So Kindred does just that, and nearly gets a sneaky smite seal on the enemy Gromp. But Viego is no slump, he had the foresight to kite it down to safety to prevent this exact scenario. Onda then retreats and heads back to his Krugs. However, if we go back to that invade, pay attention to how Kindred saw Viego kill his wolves at the last second before he then moved to the Gromp. So as Kindred heads to her Krugs, she now knows Viego's entire blue side quadrant has been killed, the wolves and the Gromp. At the same time, she actually knows Viego's entire red side quadrant has respawned. And how does she know this? Well, a real simple trick you can use is when you start the game, pay attention to where the enemy jungler started. In this case, we knew that Viego started at his red, and then killed Krugs and Raptors. And in our case, we did red, and then killed our Raptors. It's this first minor camp you kill after your buff, in this case our Raptors, that has its respawn timer synced with the first minor camp the enemy jungler killed, in this case his Krugs. So as Kindred heads back to our red side jungle, we can see that our Raptors have respawned, and so it's safe to assume that the enemy's red side quadrant has also respawned, since the timers are synced. Given that Viego's entire blue side is cleared, and his red side has respawned, and he hasn't recalled yet, I think it's pretty obvious he will have to recall, and then head to his red side jungle. Now, despite all of that, we still want to follow simple principles we've taught you so far. We want to gather information while our actions are low, which they are since we're walking to our Krugs. We want to dismiss useless information, in this case it would be top lane, and we check our closest lanes first, in this case bot. Our bot lane is pushed up, but the enemy is healthy, so no tower dive available. However, we do know they're under threat though, as Viego is nearby, as he just killed his Gromp. And we also know that we're close enough that we can react to that gank in time. Here's a nice trick though. Instead of wasting time for a counter gank hovering the lane, you can actually just drag a camp close to the lane you may need to counter gank. This trick is great to use when you think the gank is possible, but really less likely. It's also good to use when your teammates are full health, since you know you'll have more time to react before they die if they do get ganked. Alright, and so by the time we kill our Krugs, we can be sure our bot lane is safe and that Viego actually committed to the recall and is now heading topside. Again, actions are low as we're moving between camps, so we check nearby lanes. Bot lane is pushed, but the enemy is not low enough in health to be dove. We then check our mid lane, and they're at the safety of their tower, but the minions are even, and the even minion rule dictates it's going to push towards Qiyana. We also need to keep in mind we may have a timing to gank mid after our Raptors if Qiyana shows before the wave starts pushing towards her. So nothing requires our immediate reaction though, so we know to clear our Raptors next. During this time, we spot Qiyana ganking bot lane. Notice how a very similar pattern to what you've learned about risk versus reward comes up once again. Bot lane is decently far away, so long distances are at play. And we have no camps bot side, they're starting to respawn topside instead. These are strong indicators that responding to this gank is likely a bad decision. Now, as Kindred heads to her wolves, we once again check our nearby lanes. Syndra's somewhat safe, but due to the even minion rule, it is pushing, so she'll be overextended shortly. Also, our Tryndamere has recalled, so isn't even in lane top. And what else do we know? Well, Viego's entire blue side quadrant is down, so think about it. We know Viego recalled, then headed to his topside camps. And so after Viego clears his Krugs and Raptors, we'll have no camps alive, no gank topside since Tryndamere isn't even in lane, and we'll spot Syndra is pushing mid. It's pretty much guaranteed he will try to gank mid at this moment. And yet, we see Kindred ignore mid and take our wolves instead. Why? Well, remember the previous lesson. It's not enough to know whether a gank is coming or if you can get there in time, you then need to know if you're going to win the fight. We know Viego has recalled and caught up on items, so if we do counter gank, if anything, you'll probably have an item advantage. If we then check Kindred's XP bar, we can then see she's one camp off level 5. We saw earlier when Viego ganked mid that he was able to soak an entire minion wave, giving him an XP lead over us. So it's fair to assume that if we're one camp off level 5, given that Viego has soaked a minion wave, he's probably currently level 5. And so we can stop there, as we have the disadvantage if we counter gank. We can then reevaluate this as we hit level 5. Again, notice that trick from earlier at play where Kindred pulls the camp she's taking close to the lane that she may have to counter gank. At this point, Kindred levels up, so now doesn't have that big disadvantage, and so moves mid to counter gank. This then results in her getting an easy kill on Viego and begins her snowball. Now, I know some of you may be wondering, how did Kindred even know she won this fight? But again, following the theme of this video, instead of trying to analyze all the nuances of the 2v2, let's try to simplify it into easy patterns we can apply in all situations. Firstly, when you do counter gank, there's two advantages that you have. The first is the element of surprise. The second is that the jungler who ganks first always has to put their abilities on cooldown with their laner in order to set up that gank. What this means is that when you then jump into counter gank, you're jumping in on an enemy who usually has most, if not all of his abilities on cooldown. You can see this if we go back. Kindred spotted Viego with her sweeper. If Kindred jumped in to fight at this point, she would have likely lost the fight as her Q would have been on cooldown and Viego could choose to disengage or engage with his abilities. It's not until we see Viego commit to putting his W on cooldown do we then spring the counter gank. This is how we won this despite things being relatively even. Alright, so we went over a lot, so let's quickly recap what you've learned so far. First, try to time your information gathering when your actions are low, like when moving between camps or your abilities are on cooldown when fighting camps. Second, quickly rule out any useless information. Look out for common patterns like long distance or a lack of nearby camps to identify useless information faster. Third, check your closest lanes first, as this is what you can react to, well, first. When checking lanes, look for simple markers like who's pushed or low on health, as this helps you quickly determine which laner is vulnerable to a gank. Fourth, when a gank is identified as possible, compare your current position to the enemy jungler's position. When two junglers are the same distance away from a lane, it makes counter ganking a very real possibility. Fifth, when counter ganking is possible, look for simple advantages and disadvantages. Differences in levels, health values, and items are typically the strongest indicators. However, also realize the element of surprise can be outright strong enough if a counter gank hits after players put key abilities on cooldown. Sixth, how a lack of information often leads to mistakes in decision making. If put in a tough spot where deciding what to do isn't clear, realize you can just keep yourself hidden, as this often results in the enemy jungler revealing themselves first, making a mistake, and then letting you punish them. And finally, the hope is what you really learned is the value in distilling complicated scenarios into common patterns and how this allows you to make much faster, more accurate decisions in real time. Now, what you find here on YouTube is just the tip of the iceberg. If you want to unlock your true potential, then you need to dive into SkillCapped.com. We have the largest catalog of League of Legends guides in the entire world, with over 1,500 guides and 350 unique courses. You get brand new guides every week exclusive to our website, along with our Smurf commentaries where our challenger experts walk you through how to carry out of the exact rank you're stuck in. Still unsure? Well, you can have all your questions answered by those same challenger experts. Need one-on-one coaching? We got you covered with hand-picked coaches trained to the highest standard. Don't have time for that? Use Direct Pro. Pick a past game you played and within 24 hours get a personalized video from a top 100 challenger player breaking down exactly what you can do better. The best part, all of this comes with a rank improvement guarantee. If you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using SkillCapped, you can claim a refund, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Head to SkillCapped.com and get the rank you've always wanted. Link in the description below. Alright, we here at SkillCapped want to thank you for watching until the end, and we'll catch you in the next one.